And so most of you have successfully turned in your first assignments on the online textbook, Global Lyceum. This is the first time that I use this website, so I want to get your feedback on how, like, the technology aspect. So not whether you like the assignments or not, they're assignments. Nobody likes having to do things, being forced to. But the technology aspect, was that easy? Did anybody have any technology problems? Anything like that? Okay. Okay, good. Like, I didn't get too many emails from people. The biggest issue was once I sent the email saying, hey, you don't have to do math, and please use full sentences to answer some of those questions in the boxes. I had a few emails of people who wanted to resubmit. So yes, Christian, I don't know if the system, so you try it actually, Christian. So I'm like, try and see if it lets you add it. If not, I can go into the system. Oh, Robert is saying no, it doesn't. But
once you submit, that's it.
See that, and so that's one thing I don't like. So I can go and tell the system to allow you to do it. So if you want to do it, I have no problem with letting you edit your assignment. Send me an email. I will go in. I have to do it individually for every student, so I can't just, tell the settings, always let them do it. Send me an email, and I will let you resubmit.
But before you submit it, it does tell you once you submit, that's it. So you can have a chance at that point to go back in and do
It
whatever.
warns you.
It
Don't submit too early if you aren't ready. Are you sure?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. I'm like, this one, because it was the first time you all were submitting assignments. I'm like, I'm being trying to be as flexible as I could. Some of you waited to the last minute or found it hard, and that the trick to that, by the way, to not is to make sure you look at the assignment and the instructions beforehand, because if you're working at it at like 11:30, right, right before it's due, you might have time to ask me for clarification. I had a couple of people ask me for clarification on the instructions, and that's why I sent an email out to the whole class, because I was like, oh yeah, I see how asking you to figure out the percentage might throw people off. Hi. Might throw people off. But I'm like, that's the kind of thing I want to hear. I want you to tell me that I need to clarify some of those instructions. So if you're not doing it at the last minute, I have time to clarify things. So my suggestion is to, at least if you email me like on Sunday, right, I can clarify things for you. As long as it's not like 11:30, then it's kind of late, because like you have minutes to submit. Okay, so I'm going to start grading those. I am going to get help with the grading. I have a TA assigned to the class who's been watching the recordings of the class, and I'm giving her guidelines on how I expect the grading to occur. So I'm grading some of them, and then the TA is going to take over. So if there's ever an issue with the grading where you don't understand what you lost points, or you want me to reevaluate the assignment, send me an email, and I'm always happy to look over the assignment and to better explain why points were lost, basically. The other thing with grades is that the in-class activities that we've done in the previous weeks, week 2 and week 3 activities, I haven't gone in and added zeros for people with missing activities. I'm going to do that today. So some of you are going to get an email or a notification saying you got a 0 on an assignment, and you're going to look at your grade on Canvas and you're going to panic. Don't panic. Don't panic. If I made a mistake, right? Because some of you forgot to put your names on the activities you were submitting. There was a lot of people that forgot to put their names on the lynching postcards activity. All I need you to do is to tell me that you were one of those people that forgot to put your name on it. Just send me an email and we will fix the issue right away. Right, so that it doesn't, you don't panic. And if you want to submit the assignment late, email me. We want to communicate and get these things sorted out. People who were bad at maps who had to struggle with it. Okay, and we're going to keep talking about this. Actually, the activities you did last night, those of you that waited for the last minute, will come in handy. We'll talk a little bit more about them today. I am going to share my screen really quick. Don't panic. I'm warning you, don't panic about what I'm about to talk about. I want to start talking about the midterm project. It's not due anytime soon, but I want to start preparing you for it. So if you go to, one second, getting notifications. If you go to assignment, it's not yet in the weekly modules, but if you go under assignments, you can go in and see that there's a video project. That's the midterm assignment, right? And you can look at the prompt. I've modified it a little bit. When I went through it on the syllabus, I said it would be a group assignment, and I've changed that. Since seeing you all submit your in-class activities, I realized some of you just really do work better on your own. You just do. And I don't want to set you up for failure by making you forcing you to work in a group and then have you all not submit your best possible work. So I adjusted the assignment so that it's going to be each person submits their own project, and it's a little bit shorter than I originally had designed it, right? So if anybody looked at it beforehand, I've made adjustments. So you're already celebrating. I'm like, no, I pay attention, and also like I really did see a big difference between the work people were submitting individually versus the work people were submitting in groups. It wasn't true for everyone, but for the most part, that was the pattern. So I have a rationalization for why I'm assigning the assignment this way. And it mainly has to do that the latest research on how people consume information tells us that it has dramatically changed, right? And this happens every single generation. When I was a college student, all the older generations were annoyed that we were getting most of our news from like things like Jon Stewart, late night comedians, rather than from like CNN or whatever other news programs there were. Well, it turns out that for Gen Z, the main source of information is social media. And big right now is TikTok. That's where people are going to do research onto different topics. Like instead of putting it into Google, people are putting it into TikTok. And that's where they're also seeking out educational tools. Like if they want to learn about a topic, and this is where a lot of you, the studies show us, are going. So I said, okay, if this is where people are learning history, for example, right? If people are learning history from people on social media, then we should be putting out some good information out there, because a lot of what I see sometimes is good, but there's some very iffy things out there. And one, we want to be able to distinguish between what is good, what is done well, and what is not done so well. So we're going to be working on it. Starting next week, I'll be showing you short videos of people who are teaching history topics on places like TikTok or Instagram. So what you're going to have to do is create 3 videos. Each video is going to be 3 minutes long. And your topic is of your choosing, as long as it fits under the framework of a civil rights topic. Civil rights topic interpreted widely. So I'll talk about what are some potential topics you can choose, right? And I do want you to have a bibliography or a works cited page where you tell me what are your sources, right? You can use lecture as a source. You can use any, like the textbook from the online Global Lyceum website, or you might need to do a little bit additional research. And we can talk about, and we will talk later about what sources are legitimate to use, what is not, right? But you do need to have a kind of bibliography to show that the information is good. And you can submit this. So one, if you're already very familiar with like TikTok or Instagram, you can use those sites to make your videos. Like one of the things that I do like about TikTok is how easy they make it to make good edits. Like you can actually do really good edits on TikTok, and they make it really simple for you to be able to do that. But I also understand there are ethical issues concerning some of these websites, right? And we don't know everything we are actually giving them access to when we agree to their terms and conditions. So I'm not going to force anybody to get a TikTok. You can make these videos on your computer, on your phone, and then what you will submit to me will either be a file for the video or a link to the video. Right? Somewhere it is. I am saying it has to be somewhere basically at 3 minutes, right? So that you have enough time to provide some information, right? But this is why it's going to be 3 videos. In 3 minutes, you only have a very limited amount of time to do information. So what you're doing really is a kind of series of videos on the topic. And so possible topics, right? Oh, let me actually check in with the chat. TikTok can make 3-minute videos. TikTok can. I think Instagram cannot, but TikTok will allow you to make 3-minute videos. You don't have to use it. You don't have to use it. Like I said, you can just submit a video file on its own. Canvas would allow you to submit a video file or like a YouTube file. So YouTube makes it very easy for you to upload a video on there and then submit a link rather than an entire video file. Crystal's asking a very important question. Can you cite YouTube as a source? It depends on what the YouTube is. Crash Course, for example, is a good source because I know that they check their information. And if it's just some random nobody on YouTube whose credentials you can't even check, no, you want to use more trustworthy sources. However, if you find a professor who's written a book on a particular topic and they have a video on YouTube up, yes, that would be a legitimate source. All 3 of the videos you make have to be on the same topic. They have to fit the same topic, right? Eric, don't cite Ben Shapiro. Yes, Ben Shapiro does not count as a legitimate source. Absolutely. But you want to think about this because 3-minute videos, right, means you can't be too broad, right? You want to pick something that's narrow enough that it's doable, but that'll also give you enough information to make these 3 different videos, right? So picking the topic is important, right? I put in here some potential topics. Some stuff will be obvious, like anything that fits during the time period of the 60s and the 70s. And that is the civil rights movement, that counts. But I want you to think broadly about how we think of civil rights, right? It's about desegregation, yes, but also farm workers' rights. So if you're interested in like Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, unions, that is a civil rights topic. Right? Gay rights. Right? However, if you're going to do gay rights or something like that, right, you want to narrow it down from that. What within the topic of like gay rights in the US are you most interested in? Marriage equality, on gender identity, violence against different groups. Like you want to pick something more narrow that you can then do these videos on. But you can also go further back in history. Chinese exclusion, that's a civil rights topic, right? The contraception movement, abortion. We're going to talk about those topics in this class, so those count within the framework of civil rights. Attacks on nations, either during World War II or during the pandemic, are civil rights issues. Japanese internment would count. Interracial marriage and laws pertaining to interracial marriages. The topic of forced sterilizations. Native American reservations, right? Any like riots or uprisings. So if you're particularly interested in like the Rodney King riots, the Watts riots or uprisings, those would be good topics to pick. Black Lives Matter. I think any of those topics would be great. They fit under the headline of civil rights. You do want to pick something specific. You can run it by me, so you can always send me an email or chat with me after class, and you can run a topic by me just to make sure that it's something that's going to be doable, right? It can't be so big that it's not doable, that you'll never be able to including all the information in, but it can't be something that like there's no information on. You need to be. I want to make sure that there's something that you have enough information on the topic you want to do. Right. So let's see what the questions are. Allison asks, can you narrow it to something like Stonewall? Yes, Stonewall's a great topic. Brandon says, are the 3 minutes more of a suggestion or a requirement? It has to be between 2 minutes and 50 seconds and 3 minutes. So I'm like, I'm not going to be it's super precise. It has to be 3 minutes, but it should be within a 10-second window around the 3 minutes. Will it be graded based on the amount and quality of the information? It'll be graded on the information. And in terms of quality of the video, most of you can make really great quality videos, even if you're just using like your phone or your computer. My main concern with like quality of that is, can I hear you? Can I hear the information? So as long as the information is clear, it can be heard, that's what I'm more interested in. I'm not a tech person, so I'm not going to grade you on technology. I'm going to grade you on the information you're providing and your presentation of that information. Roe v. Wade is definitely a topic that would count. You can do Roe v. Wade. Thank you. Somebody noticed that I do have it in the instructions of the time frame windows. I want it to be, so this is a history project. So I don't want you to, somebody asked privately, can you do like a film that talks about interracial marriage? That cannot be the focus of all 3 of your videos, but you can include a short discussion of a movie that had a particular significance or impact. Yes. Yes, this thing we're talking about, this is what your midterm will be. Oh, yes. So Asian representation on film would be a great topic. That is a historical topic. It's also a media topic, but it's a historical topic. Historians have written about it. Your source can be an interview you did with someone. Yes, personal interviews are sources. You can absolutely go past 1970. Historians debate a lot what counts as history, but I say if it happened a second ago, it's history. So you can go into 2022. So in that sense, like news articles on a topic would be a legitimate source. So the main thing, right? You don't have to have a topic set in mind. The reason I'm talking about it this early is that you want to start thinking about those topics. Every time we meet in class, we're going to talk about a topic that you could potentially do your video project on. Right. So every time, like I look through everything I'm talking about, I'm like, yep, these would all be great topics. So it can be something we talked about in class. It doesn't have to be, but it can be. Crystal with another technical question. Should it be works cited, or what style should be in? I don't care. It could be MLA, it can be Chicago, it can be APA, whichever one you're most comfortable with, as long as you're using one of those styles. So as long as it's organized and it's not just a bunch of links. I'll walk you through every aspect of this too as we get closer to the midterm. Right? I'm not just going to be like, read the prompt and submit your project. But other questions? It does not have to be mentioned in the video. Emily, your works cited, you will submit it separately. You will submit it separately. In the video, by the way, you don't have to be in it. And I'll talk about how you can make a video without you in it. Sometimes it's easier to just like set up a camera and record yourself talking, but no, you can have just images and you do a voiceover. It's actually now really easy to do that with just some basic technology with like, as long as you have a computer, a laptop, or a phone, or a tablet, it can be done fairly easily. It's supposed to be an informational video. Yes, I will give you some examples too as we go along. I'll give you examples of some that are good and some that maybe what I would consider more iffy. Yes, Allison, and that's exactly what the project is, a 3-part series on a topic. Yeah, some of you are really shy, but it's just something to start thinking about, right? Okay, like I said, let me go back to where we left off last week, because I wanted to add a few more things, especially now that you did those activities on the Global Lyceum website, right? We saw that the Chinese Exclusion Act had a major impact. And what's interesting though, is that it was an overreaction to Chinese immigration, because when you look at the numbers, California was really the state with the most number of Chinese immigrants. And it wasn't the number of Chinese immigrants in California didn't make up a large percentage of the population, right? At that time, we're still talking about a California in which a majority of the population was of Mexican heritage, right? Because the territory had just become American territory. It'd been Mexican territory before. So there was still a majority of Mexicans in California. But rapidly changing demographics in California at the time as more Anglos were coming to California. Also, a lot of people fleeing the segregated South. A lot of Black communities are getting established in California. So it's becoming more and more diverse. Yes, Evangelina, you can do slides. It's for the project. Yeah. So it's just this nativist reaction that's also very racist. Nativism usually includes some level of racism, right? And we see it very clearly with the reaction to Chinese immigrants, right? They go from being described in kind of positive ways by the railroads, right? The railroads want Chinese workers because they're seen as just great workers that are easy to exploit. The rest of the population is not so interested in whether they're good workers or not. They're interested in these people are different, right? They're visually different. And so they're being described as heathen, morally inferior, savage, childlike, lustful. Does this sound familiar? It should sound familiar. It's the same kind of wording, right, that was used for other non-white groups before that, right? For Native Americans, for Black people, and now here it is those same exact words being used to describe Asian Americans, as there's this reaction to growing number of Asian, especially Chinese immigrants in the U.S. And because there's already a pattern, right? By the time Chinese immigrants are coming to the US in large numbers, there's already a pattern on how people who are not seen as white get treated, right? And one of those ways is as a threat not just to the nation, but a threat to whiteness, right? And so one of the first issues legally was, wait, can a Chinese immigrant marry a white woman? And the law at the time said that anyone that fit into the category of Indian, Negro, Black and white, that these were the racial categories. There were Indian, Negro, Black, and white. That anybody that fit into the Indian, Negro, or Black categories could not marry a white person. Well, what about Asian Americans or Asians, right? What about Chinese immigrants? Where can they marry white people? Can they be counted as white? Well, legally, we had already seen that they could not count as white. And the other term used for interracial marriage were the terms Negro, mulatto, or Mongolian. Mongolian is a really interesting term. It's a broad category during this period that basically means anybody that's other, non-white. It's not specifically talking about people from Mongolia. It was just a racist term that a lot of times was used to describe anybody who was not white. But that's where the courts look at that wording and they say, aha, we can put Chinese people under the term Mongolian. They're not white, they're not Indian, they're not Black, but we're still going to fit them in that same category. They basically say the law does not specifically say Chinese people are not white, but we're going to include them. Okay. So it's very much about race, right? The backlash. It's not just about we're protecting the US from immigrants, because no, actually, the US needed a lot of labor. Right, this is the time of building the railroads, so a lot of businesses setting up, factories are starting to pop up all over the U.S. So actually, labor is needed. There's this backlash against Chinese immigrants because they're seen as other, as non-white. Right? And so that's a lot of the social and political motivation that leads to the passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act, right, which prohibited any new Chinese immigrants from coming into the U.S. Overall, though, like you saw in the numbers from the activity due last night, it was less than 1% of the population in the United States at the time. Right. So this was very much an overreaction, a very racist reaction to what was really not a huge number of immigrants coming from China. But it has major consequences, right? One is the railroads are still working, right? So any Chinese immigrant that was already in the US can stay. And most of them will choose to stay, even though they, for the most part, a majority had planned on going back to China, but they're all going to stay because the Chinese Exclusion Act means that if they leave, they're not going to be able to come back, right? So that means that a lot of them are going to choose to stay rather than choose to go back to China. But without an influx of new Chinese immigrants, the railroads need somewhere else to find more workers. And what the railroads do is they start recruiting Mexican workers. And that is huge because if you go to the Midwest now, there are a growing number of Latino populations all over the Midwest, right? My family is part of that new wave of people that are going to like the middle of the country, right? But if you go to places like Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Nebraska, what you see is that there are Mexican communities there that are like in their 4th, 5th generation of Mexican American communities. And they get there, initially, what takes them to the middle of the country is the railroads. Men are getting recruited from Mexico to come work in the railroads. And actually, the railroads would try to incentivize these workers to come with their families by offering them box cars. You know, the boxes that make up like the trains, right? When they're transporting goods, there are these big box carts. Still today, what they would do is that they would give some of these to the workers, and they'd say, "This is your home now." So you can make the box cart into your home. And that was an incentive for some of these workers. They created their own communities of these boxcar communities. And a lot of them end up staying, right? Staying in the Midwest. And so there's this really interesting communities of Mexican Americans in places where you wouldn't think you might find them, like Kansas. And they're called traqueros. So if you look up that word traqueros, you find that's how you'll find some of this information. There's been a little bit of movement in more recent times to try to talk about these communities, but kind of limited, because most of you probably had not heard of these traqueros, right? Of these Mexicans that stay in the Midwest. No, because we were like in California, the patterns are a little bit different. The other major result of the Chinese Exclusion Act was the creation of the Border Patrol. There was no Border Patrol agents guarding the border, the Mexican and US border, or the Canadian US border, right? Those borders had been negotiated with treaties, but there's no fence there. There's nobody checking who's coming or going. And initially, you don't really want to be limiting the influx of people because workers are needed, right? So you didn't want to be controlling it. But however, because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, you start designating, usually it was like former Army veterans or former Texas Rangers get designated as a border patrol to check anyone who might look like they're Chinese and stop them from entering the US. They were particularly interested in the Mexico-US border because that's where they think Chinese immigrants can more easily arrive in Mexico and then make their way to the US. And so the creation of the Border Patrol initially is to stop Chinese immigration, not Mexican immigration. In fact, a Mexican trying to come to the US would not even be stopped. They would not be looked at. Nothing. They're not trying to impede Mexican movement across the border. It was particularly Chinese immigrants that were interested in stopping. Oh, sorry, I was checking thing. Now, there is one interesting loophole to the Chinese Exclusion Act. In 1906, there's an earthquake in San Francisco. Devastating, because most of the buildings, houses, most of the infrastructure in San Francisco was not built to sustain an earthquake. Right now, you have to, buildings have to be up to code so that they can withstand an earthquake. Well, in 1906, those kinds of regulations don't exist. And there's a fire that destroyed all municipal records in San Francisco. So if you were born in San Francisco and say you want to go get a copy of your birth certificate, the building that housed all the birth certificates has been destroyed by the earthquake, and the fire that resulted from the earthquake burned all the documents. This is an opportunity for Chinese migrants because Chinese men could claim that they were born in San Francisco, and their records were just burned in the building. And who's going to prove that that didn't happen? You can't prove it. You can't prove that these men were not born in San Francisco, and they take advantage of that in order to become citizens and to bring their families from China to the US. So natural disasters can always create all kinds of weird opportunities, and this is one where you see an uptick in Chinese people becoming citizens because of they can use the fire to claim having been born in the US. Questions about Chinese immigration or Chinese exclusion? And by the way, if you go into like the Border Patrol website, they talk about some of this early history of the Border Patrol. They're very proud of like their connection to the Texas Rangers, for example, that a lot of Texas Rangers basically become the first Border Patrol agents. But they talk about how the reason this occurs is because they're the Chinese Exclusion Act. Okay, I'm not going to have time to get too deep into the next topic. So, but I want to start talking about housing, right? One of the biggest things that we as humans do is to meet our needs is find where to live. Where are you going to live? And it's currently a hot topic political debate because of the large number of houseless people we have in like Los Angeles County and in California overall. But this has a long history, this history of who can live where and why these laws are created to restrict who can live where. Right? It's primarily affecting African Americans. Right? After the Civil War and Reconstruction, laws get passed all over the country restricting where African Americans can live. And it's technically illegal as it's happening, right? There are, at this point, so in the late 18th century, late 1800s and early 1900s, there's 3 amendments that prohibit discrimination of African Americans, including in housing. One, the Fifth Amendment. One of the readings of the Fifth Amendment is that it prohibits unfair treatment, right? Because it's like all about due process and what rights you have when you are being accused of a crime. Well, part of the rationale for the Fifth Amendment was about fairness, right? And so one of the legal interpretations is that it prohibits unfair treatment. Then, though, you have the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment prohibits slavery as an institution. And in the wording, legally, it's also supposed to make unfair treatment illegal, especially specifically of Black people. And then the 14th Amendment is equal protection under the law. So it's very much meant to prohibit discrimination. Right? The 13th and 14th Amendment are in place after the Civil War. They're passed during Reconstruction. But are people following following the law? No. Right? What we see is that even legally, actually, people end up ignoring the law. Eventually, the Supreme Court will decide on cases and basically legalize discrimination, right? And like separate but equal. But in 1883, the Supreme Court rules that the government cannot regulate the housing market. That you cannot tell someone who they can sell their house to or not. And that you can't tell somebody that owns an apartment building who they can rent to. Essentially, creating a pathway for very racist housing laws. That Supreme Court decision is the law of the land and all over the US until 1968. 2 big things happened in 1968. The NAACP had been challenging these laws, and eventually the Supreme Court decides that no, actually the federal government must regulate housing. It very much has a right to regulate it, especially when it comes to issues of discrimination. And because of activism from civil rights leaders and people all over the country, Congress passes the Fair Housing Act, which prohibits discrimination based on race when it comes to who can rent an apartment or who can buy a home. But between 1883 and 1968, there is severe discrimination of people when it comes to housing. Well, when it comes to anything really, but severe discrimination, right? Before 1883, though, they'd already started trying to regulate who can live where. And they did it by terror tactics, right? During that period of Reconstruction, we talked about how African Americans were actually doing really well, right? One, because they were being protected, right? So their right to vote and to elect officials was being protected by the Union Army all over the American South. But at the tail end of Reconstruction, just as Reconstruction is about to end, we begin seeing these terrorist tactics emerge, right? The example I have here is the Hamburg Massacre in 1876. This is in Hamburg, South Carolina, right? The massacre begins with a Black militia group that is participating in the 4th of July parade, right? And they're doing like military maneuvers down the town center, which they were legally allowed to do. 2 white farmers try to pass where the militia group is doing their exercises. And they can't get through because the militia group is doing their exercises. They try to force their way through and they are not able to. So this leads to a reaction from the white population in Hamburg, where white men just begin arming themselves. They're going to force these Black militiamen to disperse, but also now they're just going to be attacking these men, right? So this white mob forms, and they start attacking every Black person they see. Right? They are actually able to force the Black militia into one of the buildings, and they end up killing a total of 10 people. Part of the goal of this massacre is to remind Black people in Hamburg, South Carolina, what their place is, right? It's like, no, you can't just come in here and do whatever you want, do military maneuvers as part of the parade. No, you are not welcome. And actually, you can't just live wherever you want, and we also don't want you to vote. Right? It's the white mob enforcing what they want to see, which is illegal. It's illegal. But it's really important because it's not just the mob violence. We see how the mob violence is directly connected to the politics that are emerging, right? Because this violent reaction towards African Americans in Hamburg actually leads to Benjamin Tillman, who was a white politician at the time, to be elected to this US Senate. In 1876, there's an election. And so that's actually why there's a series of violence against African Americans. It's because they were trying to stop African Americans from voting. When they were doing that in the years right before that, they were electing Black people. Right? So Benjamin Tillman campaigns on stopping Black people from voting and basically returning Hamburg to a white majority. And he is so successful at it that he's going to get elected to the Senate, serve for a full term, and is one of the most pro-segregation politicians of the time. Right? He also, this mob in Hamburg ends up creating the Red Shirts group, which is one of these early predecessors to the KKK. Right? Like, you don't have a formal KKK yet, but people are forming these groups, and like the beginning of them, the beginning of the KKK is here and trying to stop African Americans from voting. Um, do I have to? Oh, I'm like checking my time. I'm like, oh, actually, I do have time to get into all of this. Okay, I thought my time was running out, but I'm looking at the clock and I'm like, oh, okay, we can talk a little bit more. Um, so, so one, why is this important? Why is it important to talk about some of these massacres, the election of these people, and these violent groups that were forming in the 1870s and 80s? You guys tell me. Should I not be talking about this? I
Is
mean,
it
clearly,
because this would have led to the civil rights?
and to the patterns we see today, right? Where people live, it all comes back to this, right? Like, why do we have such segregated cities and towns? Well, initially in the 1880s and 1870s, they wouldn't have been as segregated as they are today. Yeah, and it's a deep effect on especially the Black community, but it has a deep effect on the white community. And even as waves of immigrants are coming, right? Waves of immigrants arrive and they're coming into a heavily segregated society. And they have to decide where they fit within these patterns, right? We'll come back to that. But okay, if you're thinking like, okay, this extreme kind of violence against African Americans is happening in the South. It's very clear it's happening in the South. It's being allowed, right? There were a couple of these white farmers were arrested, but they were never prosecuted. They were let go. So like the murder of the 10 Black men in Hamburg was illegal. Nobody does anything about it. Right? In fact, they elect one of the most racist politicians of the time to the Senate. One of our first thoughts is always like, I wouldn't stay, leave Hamburg, leave these places. And one of the things that I always say to that is, one, it's really hard if you don't have money. It's really hard if you have older folks in the family that can't travel over long distance. Yeah. Question.
So on the map that we used for our assignment, it had like one little area that had Black, looked like colored people or whatever.
Yeah.
So if they were already here and well, not here, but I'm sure Chicago, that was Chicago, right?
Yeah.
But, so they hadn't made it to that far.
They had.
Yeah.
They had, we'll get to that. They have made it to Chicago, but they're being segregated, right? So in that map of Chicago is not a full map of all of Chicago. It's only one section of Chicago.
Right. But they weren't even like really visible there, even though it was a large immigration community. It just seemed like they would have been there already, and then they came or something.
So that's actually a huge point. So the reason is, as immigrants are coming in and figuring out where they can live in these cities, they part of what assimilating, right? There's a lot of pressure when new immigrants come to this country to assimilate, right? To learn the language and adapt. Well, one of the things that is being asked is to adapt a new attitude about race. Right? They haven't had to make these decisions all the time in the countries they come from. But they arrive in the US and they're coming to a segregated US, and they have to make a decision about whether they're going to adopt these racist attitudes or not. And it can be split. It can be split within some immigrant communities, but the large pattern is most immigrant communities will try to become white, because to be white is to receive privileges. Right? You don't want to be in the same category as Black people in the US. Black people are being restricted. They have no rights to vote. They don't have a right to live wherever they want. Like, they have limited rights. So when new immigrants come, they see that dynamic and they're like, okay, yeah, I don't want to be over there. I want to be in the white category. And so that's why you see like the Irish, the Italians, the Bohemians, all these people are going to accept the attitude of, nope, being Black is bad. We are white. Yeah. But Black people were leaving the South. It's not the Great Migration yet. They're not leaving in as large numbers as they will later on. But immediately after the Civil War, people left, especially single men. Single Black men are leaving the American South. One of the places they end up where they're doing really well initially was Montana. Has anybody been to Montana? I'm like, I've been to Montana. I went to a conference up there once. You've got to be okay with the cold. Yeah, Kip?
I was just saying I've been to Montana before.
And what are the racial how many Black people did you see in Montana?
I don't recall. It was a while ago.
Yeah, no, I'm like, you don't currently have a large Black population in Montana. Anna Montana, Emily. So we're talking about the state of Montana. Initially, a large number of African Americans end up in Montana. One, it's a territory where you can have access to land. You can go claim land. Native people are being restricted, right? They're being restricted more and more. There was a thriving Native American communities up in Montana, but they're being moved out of the way. And so there's opportunity to make money and to buy land in Montana, right? In 1890, there were African Americans living in every single county in Montana. Everywhere where there were humans in Montana, there were Black people in 1890. By the 20th century, though, by the early 20th century, you're going to see less and less Black people in Montana. Right? So this is by 1930, 11 counties in Montana have no Black people. They went from Black people everywhere to wait, now in some of these places, you cannot find a single Black person. Right? In the capital of Montana, Helena at the time, in 1910, there were 420 Black people. In 1930, so 2 decades later, there's 131 Black people. In 1970, there were 45 Black people in Montana. In the capital, in Helena. In 1910, there were 113. What happened? How did we go from 420 to even today, right? There's only a little over 100 Black people in the capital of Montana. What do we think happened in Montana?
They made it unbearable, unlivable for them, so they left.
Yeah, they would be violent. So the white communities would get together, right? This is a large state where people lived miles away from each other, but they would get together, white men would get together, and they would physically threaten Black people and force them to leave. You are not welcome. Yes. And they're getting killed. People who are refusing, right? Because people are some people are right away going to be like, okay, I don't want to deal with this, I'm leaving. But some people were standing their ground and saying, no, I have every right to live here. And you get lynchings in Montana, right? Emily and Medea say, yeah, unfair treatment. And they're starting to pass laws that say, wait a minute, not only do we not want you here, now we're going to pass a law that says you can't live here. And that continues, right? This is not a one-time event, right? We tend to think of the period of segregation as okay, it happened during this one time. It's no, it's a continuous thing. Those laws aren't just left on the books and nobody's enforcing them. No, they're enforcing these laws violently a lot of times. Another element of this unfair treatment is passing sundown ordinances. So this is all at the local level. Different towns and cities pass sundown laws. Can anybody tell us what a sundown law or ordinance is?
If you're Black, you better be in the house before sundown. Out
Yeah.
there.
I meant legally, Black people are not allowed out in public after dark. Yeah, Alexandra, like a curfew. It's exactly a curfew only for Black people. You
Hey,
cannot
but
be out.
Glendale had it before in the 70s. After 10 o'clock, if you were Hispanic Black, they would lock you up in jail and
Yeah.
release you in the morning.
And that's the larger point. This isn't, we're not talking about just in the South where you're like, well, okay, over there, because they're so racist, they do it. No, this is happening everywhere in the Midwest, in California, in the Southwest, in New York. You have similar things happening. And so a lot of these laws are still in the books in some places. They're still there.
And the Black people used to pass like a map or tell you where you could go or not go to travel so you wouldn't get caught up.
Yeah, it was such a problem that Black people started sharing information. This is where, like kind of like the Green Book of like, these are places that are friendly for the Black community. This is where you can go eat or stay, and this is where you avoid. Do not go through this place. It is dangerous. Yeah. So this was not like hidden. Not just local governments knew, the states knew about these laws, the federal government knew about these laws. They should be legal. They contradict the amendments we talked about earlier, the 15th, the 13th, and the 14th Amendment. But if nobody enforces those amendments, then what good do they do? They don't do any good, and basically every level of our governments agrees that they're going to allow this to happen. Now people are fighting back, right? Groups like the NAACP, which existed, before the 1960s and 70s, are trying to challenge this in courts, and people are trying to stay and live in places where they're not legally allowed because they know it shouldn't be legally allowed. But these mobs are always enforcing these practices. Now, very rarely during this period does the Supreme Court do something that is meant to help Black people, right? But in 1917, there's a Supreme Court case, Buchanan v. Warley, that said that racial zoning in Louisville, Kentucky was unconstitutional. So that if there's a white person, a white homeowner that wants to sell their house to a Black person, that you cannot stop the white homeowner from selling to a Black person. Now, the Supreme Court makes this decision to say that racial zoning is unconstitutional, not because they believe in equality, right? The Supreme Court at this time is also saying all kinds of other things that they don't think the Constitution should protect or protects Black people from discrimination. But they do it on basically economic purposes. They say somebody who owns something should not be restricted on who they can sell to. Right? So if somebody's trying to sell their home, they should be able to sell to anybody regardless of race. Right? So this effectively says racial zoning, meaning the idea of segregating Black people to only one part of town or to only certain streets, is unconstitutional. What do you think the effect of that is? This is the Supreme Court saying segregation in housing is illegal. Medea has basically zero effect. Zero effect. Why? Most cities are going to come up with excuses about why the Louisville law is different than the law they're passing, and say, wait, the decision of the Supreme Court only applied in Louisville, Kentucky, and does not apply anywhere else. Yeah, because they want to keep doing what they're doing. They want to keep segregating their towns and cities, right? But they all do have to make a case, because they have to be careful about how they word their laws, how they're passing ordinances. And so all these towns are going to give us an excuse about why their racial segregation is okay.
And the whole segregation thing would have been fine, but they didn't even want them to live in their own areas by themselves.
Exactly.
Yeah, and actually we'll talk about how they actually make the black part of town, they hurt, they go out of their way to hurt those parts of town. So Atlanta, by the way, they say, wait, our segregation is different and necessary in order to maintain public peace. Their argument was that if Black people and white people live together, it's going to create violence and problems. So in order to keep the peace, we need to segregate the communities. Now, the whole public peace, they're actually probably right, but it's not because of Black people, it's because of white people. They're the ones who would not keep the peace.
Still.
Right? In Indianapolis and New Orleans, they word the law so that it says, okay, a Black person can buy a house in a white neighborhood as long as all the white people in that neighborhood agree. And so they say, we're not being racist. We're saying, hey, you can buy here, but everybody here has to agree to let you move in. They know that that's never going to happen, right? It is in fact segregation. Cities like Richmond, Virginia, they said that they needed to segregate the communities to prevent interracial marriage. They said interracial marriage is bad, and in order to prevent people from marrying one another, we have to physically keep them apart. And so kind of one of my main points is like, nobody's hiding the racism here. Like nobody's hiding it. They're being very specific and very forthright in telling us their racist attitudes. And this isn't, I mean, it's the 1900s, it's the 20th century. So we're talking about, that generation of people have only recently passed away. A lot of people who were kids during this period might still be alive. So we're not talking about that long ago. We're talking about a couple of generations ago. The other big thing is we're talking about this. It's not just that we're going to keep people separate. It's we're going to make the living conditions for Black people as bad as we can, right? Because every town has laws about where you can establish a building, where you can build a house, where it's going to be industrial area, right? Where a factory can be created, because you don't want to put like a factory with a lot of pollution right next to the elementary school, right? You don't want things like that. So if you want the factory in your town, it's like, okay, we do want you to come, but maybe you're going to be further away from where people live and where people go to school. These are kind of basic things. So when businesses were applying for permits from a town, things like factories, taverns, liquor stores, nightclubs, prostitution houses, because it was not illegal everywhere, would not be allowed to open in white neighborhoods. You could not open a liquor store in a white neighborhood. Even
to this day, you can still see the effects of that.
Yep, because they said, but even though the law of the town says you can't open any of these places near like where people live, they would make exceptions in Black neighborhoods. Oh, you want a liquor store next to that big apartment building? No problem. Oh, you want to open a prostitution place right next to the elementary school? No problem. As long as it was in the Black neighborhood, they would get their permits. And yeah, and think about how hard, like once a business is established, right? And if it's doing well, like getting people, changing the dynamics of a town or a city can be very difficult. So once you establish that, what they are doing is creating slums that will be very difficult to undo until today. Like the reason some places are still like slums, or like when I was growing up, we talked about ghettos. Like the reason why those places exist today can usually you can trace it back to this early 1900s when they're doing this. Madia says, if I was born in 1917, I would be 105 years old, but my aunt's spouse recently celebrated her 107th year-old birthday. I'm like, a lot of these people aren't even gone. Yeah. Yeah, I'm like, it sounds like a long time ago, but I'm like, we're not that many generations removed from this time period. Yeah. Right behind a nightclub. Yeah. Like stuff like that, like the city's in charge of, like there's permits and all this paperwork that you have to go through to get to it. And even today, these decisions are clearly being informed by some racial elements, even today. But back here in 1917 and early 1900s, there's no hiding it. They're not hiding it. They're very proud of what they're doing. Right, in terms of they're separating Black people. And then, by the way, this is where a lot of racial stereotypes get created, right? This idea that, oh, well, Black people drink too much, they don't take care of their houses or their homes. Later on, they're going to use that excuse for segregation, right? Black people are dirty and they don't take care of their homes and they don't take care of themselves. And look at these Black neighborhoods. It's clear evidence that of these racist stereotypes. But wait a minute, who created those conditions in these neighborhoods?
The state.
It was the state with their zoning laws, allowing the liquor store there, allowing the factory that's now polluting the neighborhood and causing health problems in Black communities. Like all of those that become stereotypes were created by racist laws and racist zoning decisions. Yeah, same here. I'm like, but part of it is they want to ignore all of this because they're like, well, we don't do this anymore. Well, one, we do this in a lot of places today, but we need to undo. We can undo things instead of allowing them to continue, right? What else did I see? Yeah. Oh, and we'll talk about LA, by the way, because part of the goal here is to talk about how this is not just happening in the South. This is happening in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in New York, in San Francisco. Like San Francisco, the way, or the Bay Area, the way it exists today hasn't occurred yet. It occurs over the course of the 20th century that people start moving to the Bay Area and making these cities, and they deliberately are doing all of these racist things to make the Bay Area or white neighborhoods in the Bay Area into profitable, wealthy neighborhoods and segregate everybody else into poor conditions, poor living conditions, and economically unstable neighborhoods. Slums. Yeah, into slums. I'll say one more thing before I have a few more things to talk about in terms of housing, but I'll say this. Public housing was a big deal in the 20th century, especially in the 1930s. Like the government had to provide public housing, right? Like in the 1930s, when people are losing their jobs in large numbers, the government takes on the project of providing public housing for people. But initially, like in the 1920s and 30s, a majority of people living in public housing were white. Now we get this in the 90s and 80s, there's all this talk about stereotype about how Black people are taking advantage of the welfare state and public housing. And I'm like, the public housing projects and programs were created to help white people. They were not open to Black communities. Then in places like California and the American Southwest, so there was that large Latino population that included Latino people. They would be included in these laws and these policies, right? In fact, we'll get to talking about California and how we go from a majority Latino population in California, and the same laws start getting passed in towns and in cities that are going to segregate Latinos who were doing really well, who were wealthy. And kind of reduce their status, making them into second-class citizens. Okay. The activity for the week is going to be an activity that we're going to, that I'm like, you can't complete it yet because I haven't given you all the information. So we're going to do it on Wednesday. Does that sound fair? So we won't do it now. We'll do it on Wednesday. If you want to get started though, it's on Canvas. I put the activity on Canvas, and so you can start it now. So if you go on Canvas under week 4, you can get started. But I'll give you some time to do it on Wednesday because I've run out of time. Nope, you're going to do it on your own.